Yang Xinhai entered through the window. It was his second murder. He stepped inside the house and quietly opened the door to a small room. In front of him, a 23-year-old young woman was sleeping. That wretched man struck her neck with an axe. A faint gasp escaped her lips as her head separated from her body. Then he committed assault on the lifeless, headless corpse. After that, he killed the rest of the family. He even killed a child, cooked the body, and ate it. Then he calmly walked away. Wait, this is the real killer who murdered 67 people in China. So stay with us for more true crime stories, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The moon hovered low in the sky, casting a cold, pale glow over the quiet neighborhood. A cat darted from one shadow to the next, its eyes reflecting the distant streetlight. The air had the scent of rain, an eerie calmness that seemed to whisper of secrets untold. In a nondescript house, the soft snores of a sleeping family filled the darkness. Unseen by the unassuming residents, the lock on the back door clicked open with a muffled sound. The door inched inward, revealing the silhouette of a man, tall and lean, clutching a hammer in his gloved hand. His breathing was even, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. Yang Xinhai, the monster killer, had arrived. His heart raced with the thrill of the hunt, his mind a twisted labyrinth of malicious intent. He moved through the house like a ghost, his feet making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the warmth of life to extinguish. He found her in the second bedroom, a young woman curled up in a cocoon of blankets. She was alone, her husband working a late shift at the factory. She was beautiful, her features delicate in the moonlit room. Yang's hand tightened around the hammer, his thoughts spiraling into a frenzy of violence and desire. This was his moment, the climax of his twisted symphony. He took a step closer, the floorboard groaning beneath his weight. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open in confusion and fear. But by then, it was already too late. Summary-1, Yang Xinhai, the notorious monster killer, breaks into a house at night, seeking his next victim. He enters a room where a young woman lies sleeping, alone and unsuspecting. The tension builds as the moon casts a cold light, setting the scene for his violent intentions. With a swift, brutal swing, he brought the hammer down, the sickening crunch of bone and the wet thud of a life snuffed out echoing through the room. She jolted upright, a silent scream frozen on her lips, before collapsing back onto the bed. Blood began to seep through the fabric, pooling like a dark flower. He stared at her for a moment, his breath hot and ragged, his eyes drinking in the horror he had created. Then he moved on, searching for more prey to claim. In the next room, he found a teenage girl, fast asleep and oblivious to the monster in her midst. He approached the bed, the hammer rising high. But as the weapon descended, something within him hesitated. A flicker of doubt, a memory of a younger sister lost to illness. His hand trembled, the blow glancing off her shoulder instead of her skull. She awoke with a shriek, and the spell was broken. Yang fled, the house's silent sentinel, now a cacophony of panic and terror. The girl's cries pierced the night, alerting neighbors who had been lulled into a false sense of security. Lights flickered on, doors slammed open. Yang slipped out the front door and into the shadows, the taste of failure bitter on his tongue. But he knew he would not be denied for long. His thirst for blood and power grew with every escape, every new face that stared back at him from the abyss. And as the sirens grew distant, he vanished into the night, the monster killer leaving only pain and grief in his wake. Over the next few months, the quiet neighborhood transformed into a cage of fear. Windows were barricaded, dogs barked at every shadow, and children played under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Yet the monster remained elusive, striking when least expected. The police force was in disarray, their every move scrutinized under the unforgiving glare of public outrage. Each new murder was a macabre masterpiece, each crime seen a twisted canvas painted with the lifeblood of his victims. One evening, a young mother stepped from her bath, wrapping herself in a towel. The warmth of the room belied the chill in the air outside. Yang waited, his breath a silent whisper in the darkness. He had studied her routine, knew the exact moment she would be at her most vulnerable. The door creaked open, and she spun around, eyes wide with terror. He stepped into the room, the gleam of his axe reflecting in her eyes. With a savage growl, he swung the weapon, aiming for the softness of her neck. But she was not like the others, she was a fighter. The axe bit into the wooden frame of the bathroom door as she darted away, screaming for her children. Yang pursued her, the thrill of the chase driving him onward. His breathing grew harsher, his steps quicker, his eyes alight with the madness that had consumed him. He cornered her in the living room, the children huddled behind her, sobbing into their mother's skirts. The mother stood her ground, her body a shield for her babies. Yang raised the axe, panting with excitement, his heart hammering in his chest. But as the blade began its descent, something within him snapped. The face before him morphed into that of his own mother, her gentle eyes filled with pleading. The room swam before his eyes, and he stumbled back, the weapon slipping from his grasp. He turned and fled, the mother's screams of terror echoing in his mind as he disappeared into the night. This close call shook Yang to his core. The line between his reality and the monstrous fantasy he had constructed had blurred. He knew he had to find a way to regain control, to silence the whispers of doubt that had begun to plague him. So he waited and he watched and he planned. For the monster killer was not yet ready to be stopped. He had too much darkness left to unleash upon the world, too many lives to claim before the final curtain call. The next target was a widow, living alone in a house at the edge of town. The air was thick with the scent of her loneliness, a scent that drew him like a moth to a flame. He waited until the moon was high and the town was asleep before approaching. The window was unlocked, a silent invitation to the night's horror. He slithered through the gap, his eyes adjusting to the gloom as he stalked through the empty hallways. Her room was at the end of the corridor, the door slightly ajar. He could hear her quiet sobs, the sound of a broken soul. It excited him, fueled his need for dominance. He stepped closer, the axe held tight against his side, his heart racing like a wild animal's. As he reached out to push the door open, a sudden noise startled him. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. He spun around, his eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. It was her standing in the doorway, a kitchen knife clutched in her trembling hand. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was a spark of defiance in them that ignited his fury. He lunged at her, the axe arcing through the air. But she was quick, darting to the side, the blade slicing through the fabric of his shirt. He stumbled back, his rage boiling over. He would not be bested by a mere woman. Their dance of death played out in the shadowy hallway, a macabre ballet of survival and malice. The widow's knife flashed in the moonlight, a silver beacon of hope against the monster's rage. Yang swung the axe again, his movements a blur of lethal intent. She parried with surprising skill, a desperate strength born from the need to protect herself and her home. Their breaths mingled, hot and frantic, as they circled each other. The walls were silent witnesses to their struggle, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear. Yang's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to find an opening in her defense. He feigned a clumsy lunge, and she took the bait, lunging forward with the knife. He stepped aside, the blade grazing the air where he had been, and brought the axe down in a powerful arc aimed at her midsection. With a scream of triumph, she ducked, and the axe embedded itself in the wooden floorboards. In that split second of victory, she saw the horror in his eyes as he realized he had underestimated her. But it was fleeting. She took a step back, her chest heaving, and the floorboard beneath her foot gave way. Yang seized the opportunity, his hand shooting out like a snake, wrapping around her ankle. She toppled, her knife flying from her grasp. The world slowed to a crawl as she fell, her eyes meeting his. He yanked her towards him, the axe wrenching free with a sickening sucking sound. She clawed at the floor, her nails leaving bloody furrows. But it was no use, she was in his grasp. With a grim smile, Yang raised the axe once more, the gleaming metal a silent promise of the pain to come. The widow's scream was cut short by a sudden burst of light. The front door crashed open, and a figure filled the doorway. It was the local constable, drawn by the commotion. The sight of Yang poised to strike was like a bolt from the blue. Yang froze, the axe hovering in the air. The constable's eyes widened in shock, his hand fumbling for his gun. The tension was palpable, the air charged with the electricity of impending violence. The widow lay on the floor, her eyes flicking between her would-be killer and her potential savior. Yang's smile grew, his mind racing. He knew this was his chance to escape, to vanish into the night once more and continue his reign of terror. With a snarl, he wrenched the axe free and bolted, leaving the widow gasping in relief and the constable staring in stunned disbelief. The chase was on. The constable's heavy boots pounded the floorboards as he pursued Yang through the house and into the night. The air was cool, a stark contrast to the heat of his pursuit. The killer's laughter taunted him from the darkness, a chilling sound that sent chills down his spine. The town was a labyrinth of shadows, a perfect hunting ground for the monster killer. But the constable was not easily deterred. He had sworn an oath to protect the innocent, and he would not let this monster elude justice. He sprinted through the streets, his eyes searching for any sign of movement, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The chase was a blur of darkness and desperation, a battle of wills played out in the heart of the night. The sound of a struggle up ahead brought him to a skidding halt. He rounded the corner, his gun drawn, to find Yang grappling with a young woman. She was fighting with the ferocity of the cornered, her eyes wild with terror. The constable took aim, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Police," he bellowed. "Let her go." Yang's head snapped up, his eyes meeting the constable's. For a brief moment, the two men stared at each other, the unspoken understanding of the hunted and the hunted. Then, with a roar of defiance, Yang released the woman and bolted into the night, disappearing into the shadows from which he had come. The woman collapsed into the constable's arms, sobbing hysterically as he whispered reassurances into her ear. The adrenaline that had fueled his chase now drained away, leaving him trembling and sick to his stomach. He knew he had to act quickly if he was to capture the monster killer. He radioed for backup, his voice shaky but firm, and began to organize a search of the area. As the night grew colder and the search party spread out, Yang Xinhai slipped through the streets, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. The taste of failure was bitter, but he was not ready to be caught. His eyes scanned the alleys and rooftops, seeking a path to elude the law. The town was alive with the sound of his pursuers, their flashlights piercing the darkness like 1,000 accusing fingers. He ducked into a narrow alley, his heart thundering in his chest. The shadows played tricks on his mind, turning every discarded plastic bag into a lurking threat. His breath steamed in the chilly air, the only sound his harsh breathing and the distant wail of sirens. He felt a strange mix of fear and excitement, the thrill of the hunted driving him forth. But his escape was not to be. A beam of light swept over him, and he found himself face to face with a team of officers, their guns drawn. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he was paralyzed. Then with a feral snarl, he turned and sprinted down the alley, his boots echoing off the walls. The officers gave chase, their footsteps pounding like the drums of fate. The alley grew narrower, the walls closing in around him. A dead end loomed ahead, the mouth of a trap ready to swallow him whole. Yang's eyes searched frantically for an escape, his mind racing with the panic of the cornered animal he had become. He threw himself at a nearby dumpster, shoving it aside to reveal a hidden passage. With a desperate leap, he disappeared into the blackness, their officers' shouts fading behind him. His breathing was ragged, his heart a wild beast in his chest. But he was alive. For Nell, the days that followed were a blur of fear and tension. The town was on lockdown, the people living in a state of terror as the monster killer remained at large. The constable's failure to capture Yang weighed heavily on his shoulders, a burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. Yang, on the other hand, reveled in the chaos he had wrought. He watched from the shadows as the townsfolk cowered behind bars and locks, their lives reduced to a series of furtive glances and muffled whispers. He knew that soon he would strike again, choosing another unsuspecting victim to satisfy his insatiable hunger for power. But the constable was not one to rest easily. His determination grew with each day, his resolve to catch Yang becoming an obsession. He studied the monster killer's patterns, his every move, piecing together a portrait of pure evil. And as he dug deeper into the dark corners of Yang's psyche, he began to see the cracks in the killer's armor, the weaknesses that could lead to his downfall. The nights grew longer, the air more charged with the scent of blood. The hunt was on, and the constable knew that it was only a matter of time before he and Yang Xinhai faced each other once again, in a battle that would determine the fate of the town and the souls of those who had suffered under the monster killer's reign. The constable's eyes never left the shadows as he patrolled the streets, his every step echoing like a warning to the predator he sought. His mind was a whirlwind of tactics and theories, each one more desperate than the last. Yet amidst the chaos, he remained sharp, his instincts honed by the horror that had gripped the community. One evening, as the moon painted the world in shades of silver, he received an anonymous tip. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, the words barely more than a whisper. "The monster is here, tonight." The line went dead, leaving him with a cold certainty that this was the night. He gathered his team, his heart racing with anticipation and dread. They approached the address with caution, their flashlights cutting through the dense fog that had rolled in off the river. The house was like any other, a sad facade hiding unspeakable secrets. The constable could feel the tension coiled within it, a serpent ready to strike. They surrounded the building, guns drawn, their breaths shallow and their eyes wide. Inside, the silence was deafening. They moved from room to room, the weight of their footsteps a solemn march. And then they found her, a young woman, bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Yang Xinhai was nowhere to be seen, but the room reeked of his presence, the coppery scent of fear and the metallic tang of blood. The constable's gaze fell upon the discarded hammer, the weapon of the monster killer's twisted artistry. The woman's whimpers grew louder as they approached, and the constable felt a rage building within him, a fiery need to end this nightmare. He carefully cut her bonds, his voice soothing despite the tremor that ran through his hands. As she stumbled into the light, he noticed the bruises that marred her skin, a map of the monster's depravity. The town held its collective breath as the news of the failed abduction spread. The constable knew that he had come so close, the taste of victory and retribution almost within reach. He redoubled his efforts, driven by the hope that he had found the key to unraveling Yang's twisted web of destruction. And then, one night, the constable found himself in the very heart of the monster's lair, a dilapidated shack on the outskirts of town. He approached it alone, his gun trembling in his hand. The door creaked open, and the stench of death and despair washed over him like a wave. In the dim light he could see them, the tools of Yang's trade, laid out with a sickening pride. The hammers, the shovels, the axes, each one stained with the lives they had claimed. The walls were adorned with newspaper clippings, a twisted tapestry of his crimes, a testament to his madness. But Yang was not there. The constable knew that he had been close, so very close. Yet the monster killer remained elusive, a specter that danced just beyond his grasp. The chase had become personal, a vendetta that consumed him. He would not rest until Yang Xinhai faced the justice that the town so desperately craved. The months turned into a year, the hunt stretching on like a never-ending nightmare. The townspeople whispered of a curse, a demon that could not be caught. Yet the constable remained steadfast, his eyes never leaving the shadows, his mind never straying from the hunt. And then one fateful night, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, the constable found himself in a desolate field, his breath steaming in the frigid air. There, standing before him, was the monster killer, the man who had brought so much pain to the people he had sworn to protect. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the constable saw the madness that had driven Yang to commit such atrocities. But he also saw fear, a glimmer of humanity that had been buried deep beneath the monster's veneer. With a roar of determination, the constable charged, his gun raised high. The shot rang out, piercing the silence like a scream. The snowflakes paused in their dance, as if stunned by the sudden intrusion of sound. Yang staggered back, the impact of the bullet a sharp, searing pain in his side. The constable advanced, his weapon steady, his eyes never leaving his quarry. Yang's grin was a twisted mask, his teeth bared in a snarl of agony and defiance. He had killed so many, taken so much, and now the tables had turned. The thrill of the hunt had become his own demise, the very fear he had sown now his to reap. The axe swung wildly, a desperate attempt to fend off the inevitable. But the constable was relentless, his eyes never wavering from the monster before him. Their dance of death played out in the frozen field, a ballet of justice and horror. Each step, each swing of the axe, brought them closer to the finale. The snow beneath their feet grew crimson with the monster killer's blood, a stark contrast to the purity of the surrounding whiteness. The constable felt a strange satisfaction, a grim pleasure in knowing that this night would end with Yang's capture or death. But Yang had one last trick up his sleeve. With a snarl, he lunged forward, the axe coming down in a swift arc aimed at the constable's skull. The world slowed, the cold air a knife in the constable's lungs. He threw himself to the side, the blade missing him by a hair's breadth. His gun fired twice more, the bullets finding their mark. Yang crumpled to the ground, the life draining from his eyes. The constable approached the fallen killer, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the weight of the town's collective relief, the burden of their fear lifting from his shoulders. He knelt beside the monster, the snow staining red around them, and whispered a single word, "Why?" But there was no answer, only the final gasp of a man whose soul had been lost to darkness. The constable stood, the gun still smoking in his hand, and surveyed the scene before him. The snowfall grew heavier, obscuring the horror of what had just transpired. The town would breathe easier now, the nightmare of Yang Xinhai finally over. He turned and began the long walk back, his thoughts a tapestry of victory and loss. The arrest of the monster killer sent shockwaves through the town, a collective sigh of relief echoing through the streets. Yet the scars of his reign remained, the memories of those lost forever etched into the hearts of the survivors. Yang Xinhai's name became a byword for evil, a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them safe at night. In the quiet of his office, the constable stared at the wall of newspaper clippings, the grim reminders of the lives he had failed to save. His eyes fell upon the face of the young woman he had rescued, her eyes haunted by the shadows of her ordeal. He knew that even though the monster had been stopped, the town would never be the same. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Yang was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by lethal injection. The day of his execution dawned gray and cold, a fitting end to a life steeped in brutality. As he was led to the chamber, his eyes searched the faces of those who had come to watch, seeking perhaps a glimmer of understanding. But all he found was hatred and revulsion. In his final moments, as the needle pierced his skin, Yang Xinhai had no remorse for the lives he had taken, no regret for the pain he had caused. His mind was a whirl of darkness, his thoughts consumed by the power he had wielded and the fear he had instilled. He died as he had lived, a creature of the night, a monster that had once been a man. The town moved on, the years marching forward with the inexorable tread of time. New families moved in, new lives began, and the horrors of the monster killer were slowly buried beneath layers of hope and healing. But there were those who would never forget, who would always look over their shoulders, who knew that in the quiet of the night, evil could still find a home. The widow whose life had been forever changed by Yang Xinhai's touch lived on, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She had become a symbol of survival, her name spoken in whispers of admiration and awe. Yet every time she saw a shadow move in the corner of her eye, every time she heard a strange sound in the night, she felt the cold grip of fear, the echo of the monster's breath on her neck. The constable, now a decorated detective, continued his work with a haunted look in his eyes. The hunt had taken a piece of him, a piece he could never get back. He knew that somewhere in the vast tapestry of the world, other monsters lurked, waiting for their chance to strike. And he was determined to be the one who found them, the one who brought them to justice. The nights grew quiet, the streets reclaimed by the whispers of the living. But in the hearts of those who had known fear, there was always a part that remained vigilant, a part that knew the cost of letting their guard down. The legacy of the monster killer was a grim reminder that darkness could exist in the most unexpected places, that the line between good and evil was thinner than a moonlit shadow. And as the seasons changed, so too did the town. New faces brought new stories, new whispers of horrors from other places. The constable listened, his eyes never fully leaving the shadows. For he knew that the cycle of fear and pain would continue, that there would always be those who craved power over the weak. But he also knew that there would always be those who stood against them, who fought to keep the night at bay. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with a crimson farewell, the detective found himself standing in the very alley where he had almost captured Yang. The dumpster still bore the scars of that fateful night, the rusty metal, a silent sentinel of the battle that had been waged. He stared at the spot where the monster killer had disappeared, feeling the ghosts of those lost to his blade whispering around him. With a heavy sigh, he turned and walked away, the echoes of his footsteps the only sound in the empty space. The chase was over, but the hunt would never truly end. For in the heart of every protector, there was a piece of the monster they had faced, a piece that knew that the darkness was never truly vanquished, only held at bay. And so he continued, a knight in a modern world, fighting the demons that lurked in the shadows of the human psyche. Yang Xinhai had been defeated, but his legacy lived on, a cautionary tale whispered in the quiet moments before sleep. The monster killer had taught the town that evil was not a myth, not a distant specter, but a very real and very present force. The widow who had faced him that night never forgot the look in his eyes, the cold emptiness that had chilled her to the bone. She had survived, but the scars ran deep. Years passed, and the widow found solace in the company of her children, her fear slowly giving way to a fierce determination to live. Yet every time she walked the streets alone at night, she felt his presence, a phantom touch at the back of her neck. She had become a vigilant guardian, her eyes always searching the shadows for signs of danger. The detective, now an aging man with a storied past, had never forgotten the chase. The hunt had defined him, had given his life purpose when all else had crumbled around him. In the quiet of his office, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, he pondered the nature of evil. He had seen it in Yang's eyes, had felt its seductive pull. But he knew that the world was not so simple, that the line between monster and man was often blurred. He had seen the darkness in himself, the desire to seek vengeance that had fueled his pursuit. The town had moved on, had built new lives from the ashes of fear, but he remained, a sentinel watching over the night, ready to face whatever horrors might emerge from the shadows. One cold winter evening, as the town lay dormant beneath a blanket of snow, a new terror awoke. A young woman's scream pierced the silence, a scream that held the echoes of the monster killer's reign. The detective, now retired, felt the old fire in his veins, the instincts that had never truly left him. He knew that the cycle had begun anew, that there was another predator stalking the streets. He pulled on his old coat, the one that had seen the worst of that fateful night, and stepped into the cold. The snow crunched beneath his feet as he made his way through the deserted streets, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The moon was a cold, uncaring witness, casting a silver light that revealed nothing but the emptiness around him. As he approached the source of the scream, a figure emerged from the shadows, a hammer glinting in one hand, the other reaching out to grab the fleeing woman. The detective's hand tightened around the gun at his side, the weight of his passed heavy on his shoulders. But he was not the same man who had faced Yang. He was older, wiser, and perhaps more haunted. The woman stumbled and fell, her eyes finding the detective's in a silent plea for help. He raised his gun, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The monster before him,